It was a cold and quiet evening. The wind moved softly through the trees outside Margaret's small house, making a low whistle against the old wooden windows. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of freshly baked bread. Margaret had just finished washing the dishes after her dinner. She liked her evenings to be simple. After dinner, she usually read a book, said a short prayer, and went to bed early. She had lived alone for almost 10 years. Her husband had passed away many years ago, and she never had children of her own. Life had become quiet and predictable. She knew every sound of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle tick of the old wall clock. Nothing ever surprised her anymore. But that night, something changed. Just as she was about to sit in her favorite chair with a book in hand, Margaret heard a sound she hadn't heard in a long time, a soft knock at the door. At first, she thought she had imagined it. Maybe it was the wind pushing against the old door, but then it came again. This time it was a little louder, though still weak, as if someone didn't have the strength to knock harder. She froze for a moment, holding the book close to her chest. Visitors at this hour were rare. In fact, she couldn't remember the last time someone came to her door after dark. Her house stood near the end of a quiet road surrounded by tall trees. Most of her neighbors lived far away, and the few who did live nearby never came without calling first. Margaret placed the book down and slowly walked toward the door. The wooden floor creaked under her slippers. As she reached the door, she hesitated for a second. Then she pulled her shawl tightly around her shoulders and opened it just a little. Rain was falling softly outside, and the porch light cast a yellow glow on the wet ground. Standing there shivering in the rain was a young woman. Her hair was wet and stuck to her face, and her clothes were soaked through. She was holding her round belly with both hands. She was clearly pregnant. Her eyes looked tired and her lips trembled. She whispered in a weak voice, "Please, please help me." Margaret felt her heart squeeze. The girl couldn't have been more than 20. She looked lost, cold, and scared. For a second, Margaret didn't know what to do. But then her kind heart spoke louder than her fears. She quickly opened the door wider and said softly, "Come in, dear." "You're freezing." The young woman stepped inside carefully. Her shoes left wet marks on the floor and water dripped from her coat. Margaret closed the door behind her and locked it gently. The warmth of the house seemed to wrap around the girl like a soft blanket. She let out a shaky breath as if she hadn't felt safe in a long time. "Sit down here," Margaret said, guiding her to the sofa near the fireplace. She hurried to bring a thick towel and a blanket. The girl sat quietly, her hands still on her belly, her shoulders slightly bent. When Margaret returned, she wrapped the blanket around the young woman and handed her the towel for her hair. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice soft and tired. "You're safe now," Margaret said kindly. "What's your name, dear?" "Eliza," the young woman replied, looking down at her hands. "That's a lovely name," Margaret said. "I'm Margaret. Don't worry, Eliza. You can rest here for a while." Margaret went to the kitchen and quickly made a cup of warm tea with honey. She placed it on the table in front of Eliza and watched as the young woman held the cup with both hands. Her fingers were thin and cold, but the warmth of the tea slowly brought color back to them. She took small sips, closing her eyes as if the tea was the first good thing she had tasted in days. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sounds in the room were the crackling of the fire and the rain tapping on the windows. Margaret didn't want to push her to talk, but she could tell that Eliza carried a heavy story in her heart. When Eliza finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. "I've been walking for hours. I was cold and tired, and when I saw your house, I thought maybe someone kind lived here." Margaret's eyes softened. "You were right," she said gently. "You did the right thing coming here." Eliza wiped a tear from her cheek and took another sip of tea. "I'm sorry for bothering you," she whispered. "I didn't want to trouble anyone." "You're not a bother, child," Margaret said firmly but with kindness. "No one should be out in this weather alone, especially not you." Eliza looked down at her belly and nodded slowly. "I don't have a family anymore," she said in a soft voice. "And the baby's father. He's gone." Margaret felt a deep ache in her chest. She didn't need to hear the details to understand the pain in Eliza's words. She could see it in the way the young woman held herself, like someone who had carried too much alone for too long. "Do you have anywhere to stay?" Margaret asked. Eliza shook her head. "No, I've been sleeping wherever I can, but it's been so hard lately. The nights are so cold now." I didn't think I'd make it through tonight. Margaret gently placed her hand on Eliza's shoulder. Well, you're here now, and I won't let you stay out there again. Not tonight. Eliza looked up at her with wide, wet eyes. She seemed surprised that someone cared. Margaret gave her a reassuring smile and added, You can stay here as long as you need. We'll figure things out together. Eliza's face crumpled with emotion and tears slid down her cheeks silently. She tried to speak but only managed to whisper, Thank you. Margaret brought her a clean nightgown, one of her old ones that was soft and warm. She showed Eliza to the small guest room at the back of the house. The bed had a thick quilt and there was a small lamp on the nightstand. It's not much, Margaret said shyly, but it's warm and safe. It's perfect, Eliza said, her voice breaking with gratitude. Margaret left her to change, then returned with a small tray of bread and soup. She placed it on the nightstand and said, You need to eat something. You have to take care of yourself and your baby. Eliza nodded and ate slowly. Each spoonful seemed to bring her back to life a little more. When she was done, Margaret tucked the blanket around her gently, the way a mother would tuck in her child. She switched off the light, leaving only the warm glow of the lamp. As Margaret closed the door behind her, she paused for a moment in the hallway. She leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. She hadn't expected this night to be anything special, but now everything felt different. Something had changed in her heart. For years, her house had been silent and still, but now it felt alive again. She went back to the living room and sat down in her chair. The book she had been about to read lay forgotten on the table. Instead, she stared into the fire, thinking about the young woman sleeping in the guest room. She didn't know much about Eliza yet. She didn't know what had happened to her or why she had ended up on her doorstep. But she didn't need to know everything right away. What mattered was that someone needed her, and she was there to help. The next morning, when Margaret walked into the kitchen, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Eliza was standing in the doorway wearing the clean nightgown and holding the blanket close around her shoulders. She looked a little less tired, though her eyes still carried a quiet sadness. Good morning, Margaret said warmly. How did you sleep? Eliza smiled faintly. Better than I have in weeks. Good, Margaret said. She poured her a cup of warm milk and placed it on the table. You need to keep your strength up. Eliza sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup. I can't thank you enough, she said softly. No one else would have opened their door. Margaret shook her head. Kindness doesn't cost anything, dear. I believe people cross paths for a reason. Eliza lowered her gaze. I don't know what's going to happen next, she admitted. I'm scared. Margaret reached across the table and gently touched her hand. That's all right, she said. You don't have to know everything right now. One step at a time. For the first time, Eliza smiled, a real soft smile that reached her tired eyes. It was small, but to Margaret it felt like a sunrise after a long, dark night. The two women sat at the kitchen table, sharing a quiet moment. The world outside was still cold and uncertain, but inside Margaret's little house there was warmth, safety, and a new kind of hope. Margaret didn't know what the future would bring, but deep inside, she felt that this meeting was not an accident. Eliza had knocked on her door for a reason, and maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something extraordinary. The days slowly turned into weeks after Eliza knocked on Margaret's door that rainy night. The cold season had grown deeper, and the wind outside often blew strongly through the trees. But inside Margaret's little house, there was a warm fire, the smell of soup and bread, and the sound of quiet conversations between two people who, not long ago, had been strangers. Every morning, Margaret would wake up early to prepare breakfast. She would hear soft footsteps coming from the guest room, and then Eliza would appear in the kitchen, wrapped in a shawl, holding her growing belly. Margaret always smiled when she saw her. It was the kind of smile that said, "You belong here now." Eliza began to help around the house too. She folded the laundry, cleaned the kitchen, and watered the plants. Sometimes she even sang softly while washing the dishes, and Margaret would listen from her chair by the window. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was peaceful and warm, something Eliza hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, as they sat together knitting by the fire, Eliza said quietly, "I was so scared that night when I came here. I didn't know if anyone would help me. But you opened the door." Margaret looked at her kindly. "You don't have to thank me anymore, dear," she said softly. "You were meant to find your way here. Tears filled Eliza's eyes, but they were not from sadness this time. They were from a deep feeling of being safe. As the days passed, Eliza's belly grew bigger and her steps became slower. Margaret became like a mother figure to her. She took her to every doctor's appointment, made sure she ate well, and even talked to the baby through Eliza's stomach. "You're going to be a strong little one," she would whisper, placing her wrinkled hand gently on Eliza's belly. "You already have 2 people waiting to love you." Eliza would smile shyly every time. She had never imagined she would find someone who cared for her like this. She often lay awake at night, listening to the sound of the rain or the crackle of the fire, wondering how different her life would have been if she hadn't knocked on that door. One cold evening, just as the moon rose high, Eliza woke up with a sharp pain in her stomach. At first, she thought it was just another restless night, but the pain came again, stronger this time. She sat up, breathing slowly, her heart racing. Something told her the time had come. She knocked softly on Margaret's bedroom door. Margaret opened it at once, her hair messy from sleep, but her eyes full of calm and care. "Is it time?" she asked gently. Eliza nodded, holding her belly tightly. Margaret didn't panic. She had already prepared a small bag with clothes, warm blankets, and everything Eliza would need. She had done this many times before, just in case the moment came suddenly. Within minutes, they were on their way to the hospital. The night was cold and the sky was filled with stars. Margaret drove slowly but carefully, keeping her voice calm so Eliza wouldn't be afraid. She held her hand the whole way, whispering, "You're going to be all right. I'm here." When they reached the hospital, the nurses quickly took Eliza to a room. Margaret followed close behind, never leaving her side. The room smelled of clean sheets and soft light filled the space. Eliza lay on the bed, her face pale but determined. She was scared, but when she looked at Margaret, something inside her felt strong. Hours passed slowly. Margaret stayed beside her, holding her hand through every moment. She wiped her forehead gently, whispered encouraging words, and reminded her to breathe. Eliza squeezed her hand tightly, and even though the pain was heavy, she felt less alone because Margaret was there. Then, after what felt like forever, the quiet night was broken by the soft cry of a newborn baby. It was a small, beautiful sound, but it filled the entire room with light and warmth. The nurse carefully placed the baby in Eliza's arms. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at the tiny face. "She's perfect," she whispered. Margaret stood beside her, her eyes shining with tears too. She gently touched the baby's small hand with her finger, and the baby held it tightly as if she already knew this woman. But life has a way of changing in ways we can't always expect. Eliza's health became weak after the birth. Her body was tired, and she had carried so much pain and fear before arriving at Margaret's home. As she lay in the hospital bed, she held Margaret's hand tightly. She looked at her baby, then at Margaret, and whispered softly, "Promise me you'll take care of her. Please." Margaret's heart ached, but she nodded. "I promise," she said, her voice steady and full of love. Eliza smiled faintly. She knew her baby would be loved. She closed her eyes peacefully, comforted by the thought that she had found someone kind in a world that had once felt so cold. When Margaret walked out of the hospital carrying the baby in her arms, the world felt both heavy and beautiful. Heavy because she had lost someone who had become like a daughter to her. Beautiful because she was holding a new life, a life that carried hope. She named the baby Lily after the flowers Eliza used to love. Margaret planted a small patch of lilies in the front yard, so that every spring their soft white petals would bloom in memory of Eliza. Days turned into months, and Lily grew in the warmth of Margaret's love. Margaret would sing her to sleep, feed her with gentle hands, and wrap her in soft blankets on cold nights. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with the sweet sounds of a baby laughing, crying, and breathing softly in the night. Every corner of the house changed. The guest room became Lily's nursery, with soft pastel colors on the walls and a crib by the window. Margaret placed a rocking chair beside the crib. Every night she would sit there with Lily in her arms, humming soft lullabies while the moonlight shone through the curtains. The neighbors noticed the change too. They often saw Margaret walking down the road with Lily in a warm blanket, smiling as if her heart had been given a second chance. Some asked questions, curious about the story. Others simply smiled and waved, happy to see joy returning to her face. As Lily grew older, Margaret told her stories. She told her about kindness, about courage, and about the night her mother knocked on the door. She didn't tell the story with sadness, but with love. She wanted Lily to grow up knowing her mother had been brave, a young woman who, even in her most difficult moment, found the strength to bring her into the world. Lily grew up healthy and bright. She loved listening to Margaret's stories by the fire. She loved the lily flowers in the garden, and she loved the soft old shawl Margaret used to wear on cold nights, the same shawl she wore the night Eliza arrived. Margaret grew older, but her heart felt young again. She had someone to care for, someone to love, someone to give her days meaning. On the mornings when the sun shone gently through the curtains, she would watch Lily play on the floor, her small hands building towers with wooden blocks. Sometimes she laughed so much that Margaret's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of deep joy. As Lily learned to speak, her first words made Margaret's heart melt. She reached out her tiny hand and called her Mama. It was unexpected, but Margaret didn't correct her. She simply held her close and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart. I'm here." Years later, people in the town still remembered that stormy night when a young woman had knocked on Margaret's door. Many didn't know the full story, but they saw what had grown from it. A bond stronger than anything. A family formed not by blood, but by kindness. Lily often asked about her mother as she grew older, and Margaret always told her the truth with a gentle heart. She would take her to the lily patch in the front yard, let her pick a flower and say, "Your mama was strong, and she loved you so much, and I love you too. You are a gift she gave to this world." Lily would listen carefully, holding the flower in her hand. She didn't cry. She felt loved. The seasons continued to change, the snow, the rain, the sunshine. But inside the small house at the end of the quiet road there was always warmth. Margaret had opened her door to a stranger that night, but in return, she had received the greatest gift of her life. Sometimes at night, when Lily was asleep, Margaret would sit by the fire, holding a cup of tea in her hands. She would look at the old wooden door and remember the soft knock that had changed everything. It reminded her that kindness, even in the smallest moment, can change a life forever. She whispered softly into the quiet room, "Thank you, Eliza." And somewhere in the gentle breeze that passed through the house, it always felt like Eliza's love was still there, watching over them,